And hi, Hadley. How are you?
Hi, I'm great. Thank you so much, Geraldine. Good evening, everyone. I just want to thank you all so much for joining us tonight. As Geraldine mentioned, my name is Hadley, and I am a curator here at the National Afro-American Museum and Cultural Center in Wilberforce, Ohio. I do want to dedicate the event tonight to the late Helen Gilmore. She was the founder and director of the Rossville Museum and Cultural Center. Helen was not professionally trained as a traditional historian, but she received a very specialized kind of training that was passed down through generations from her ancestor, York Ryle, who was one of the original freed people from the Roanoke Plantation. And Helen's training taught her that America had a tendency to obscure responsibility, shift blame, erase uncomfortable truths, especially when it relates to racial conflict and the treatment of African Americans. This training stressed to her that if she did not protect the evidence of her family's past herself, that others might actively try to erase it. Her son Bear once recounted to me that Helen literally ran down the street after someone had attempted to steal the family Bible that was on display. So Helen and her husband Isaac ran the museum for decades until deciding to entrust the National Afro-American Museum to carry on their work. They bequeathed to us the historical treasures that she had collected, and in 2016, we began development on a traveling exhibit called Freed Will, the Randolph Freed People from Slavery to Settlement. That exhibit is now on display at the main branch of the Dayton Metro Library until March 1st. And if you're in the area, I just encourage you to go visit it and learn more about their story. This exhibit tells that story through a series of text panels, family heirlooms and artifacts, archival photographs, and chronicles their journey from the 1800s to the present day. There are so many others who have protected this history and, like Helen, fought to preserve it, kind of in resistance to a mythologized and inaccurate past. Some of those individuals, including Larry Hamilton, Sherry Hamilton, Chris Lee, and if I can highlight somebody that I saw in the attendees, Ross Bagby, your dissertation was absolutely brilliant. Honored that you're here. You all are the reason that this story has not completely disappeared from memory. And I also just want to say that this story is ongoing. It's not just something that happened in our past. There are current efforts to restore the Rossville Cemetery, and that justice has not really been fulfilled regarding the descendants, but I will let our guests tell you more about that. And I do have the esteemed pleasure of introducing both of them. With us tonight are Gregory May and Paisha Thomas, who among their many talents are both expert storytellers. Gregory May is an historian whose work focuses on the early American Republic. Both his books, Jefferson's Treasure and what we'll be talking about today, A Madman's Will, are the products of not only his impressive writing talent and skillful historical research, but his expertise in some of the most complex and convoluted historical topics, taxes and tax policy, and then, as you well know, in Madman's Will, with law. I can honestly say that I'm not sure many others could distill all of those twisted primary sources into such intriguing narratives. His expertise was first formed while attending the College of William and Mary, and then the Harvard Law School, where he was an editor of the Harvard Law Review. Greg also served as a law clerk for Justice Lewis Powell on the United States Supreme Court, and then later practiced law in Washington, D.C. and in New York for over 30 years. He now lives in Virginia with his lovely and brilliant wife, Anna Baldwin May. And I would also like to say that in addition to his scholarly talents, Greg is an incredibly kind and gracious person. We first met while he was researching A Madman's Will and was interested in both the exhibit and our archival collection donated through that bequest of Helen Gilmore. In spite of our differences in education and experience, Greg always treated me as an equal, and I will never forget that. It was an even better compliment to me then when I read A Madman's Will and realized that I had been in the presence of a truly great historian. So I encourage you to visit his website, gregorymayauthor.com, buy his books, book him for lectures. You will not be disappointed. Paisha also came into my life through the development of that exhibit, Freed Will. As she will discuss in further detail, Paisha is a descendant of Johnson Crowder, who first makes an appearance in A Madman's Will on page 233. And is the second of the Randolph Freed People whose freedom was registered with the Charlotte County Clerk of Courts in 1846. Johnson also appears in Paisha's own memoir, Looking for Innocence. Her book presents an unflinching and raw journey through generational trauma, a desperate search for love, and an ultimate discovery of peace and direction. Much of Paisha's art performs the same kind of radical transformation, turning the decay and suffering caused by the very system Greg discusses in A Madman's Will into clean air, into rich soil, into a world we might just survive. She is a singer and songwriter with a series dedicated to the Randolph Freed People story. She is a sculptor who reappropriates the red clay on the plantation where her ancestors were held in bondage into vessels, symbolizing femininity and abundance. She's also a political organizer who in 2020 formed a collective of musicians to perform at protests around Central Ohio called Say It Loud Columbus. They have an album which is for sale along with everything else I mentioned on her website, PaishaThomasArt.com, and I can't believe she's my friend. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to you, Paisha. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you, Hadley. I'm stunned by your introduction. So thank you for all of your kind words, and it's good to be here. Thank you to the History Connection for having me, and Greg for writing this amazing book. And it's also really cool to see Mr. Bagby here in the audience. I too am a scholar of your dissertation. So I just really want to expound a little bit on the background that became this introduction that you just got of me. I'm from Piqua, Ohio, and I grew up, I would say that my initial interactions with this great story were just as anecdotal family stories. Our family tended to talk about this plight in a way that started to, I think, become even superstitious in some parts of our family. And while there were other parts of not only my family, but other descendants of John Randolph Freed People who were actively in their generation, which would have been my grandmother's generation, actively still pursuing justice for the land that Mr. May's book talks about. But the superstition part was very interesting because it seemed to be what I learned as a young person to view as maybe the reason for what I considered to be a disinterest in finding out more about the realities of this case. But also could have been just a feeling of inability to do anything about it because we throughout the generations have run up against the statute of limitations as the justification for this state sanctioned violence. And so many people would say things like Hadley mentioned York Ryle, who was a contributor to the museum. He was within one of the generations of people who was actively trying to bring justice to this story. And history says that Ryle passed away in a flood as the house where he lived was in Rossville, and it was very floodable placement, and Rossville just is a floodable parcel of land just outside of Piqua. And so then in 1991, actually on my birthday, my grandmother joined a group of other Randolph's descendants, and they took a petition to the Miami County Court and sent a letter to the Senate asking for reconsideration of the provisions of this will, which had been denied even until this day. And so on that day, my grandmother actually fell down the stairs at the courthouse. And so people started saying in our family that anytime someone, looks into getting justice for this story, something happens to them. And while, I might laugh at the superstition, we understand that when people push against a system of oppression, after a while, they are met with sometimes with misfortune. So it was always just really interesting to me. I'm a person who likes and seeks after and is, I think, obsessed with justice and treatment and just treatment of other humans. But so that was my early interaction with the story. But then some things changed in my life. I was working for the state of Ohio at the time. I was beginning to develop myself more as an artist. As Hallie mentioned, I do art in various ways, music. All of it is storytelling, but that storytelling happens through music and sculpture and the book and short stories. And so eventually during the time that my career was shifting, I started to be asked to participate in storytelling through song, and some of that interacted with the Ohio History Connection. They do an annual, or pre-COVID, they did an annual presentation at the State House where elementary school students would come and get to hear reenactments and different stories about Ohio history. So I was fortunate to be able to perform in those stories. Many Rivers, or We've Known Rivers, I think was the name of that series, where I met Anthony Gibbs. And so right around that time too, I started reaching out to Mr. Hamilton, who we've talked about already. He's a historian in Piqua who has kept really close eye on the history of the Randolph's Freed People. I had gone to I had gone on a retreat to Oberlin just to be in a mindset of Ohio history and liberation. When I went there, I had this dream and I told it to Mr. Hamilton, and he interpreted that dream to mean that I was going to enter into this storytelling, which wound up becoming true, whether I made that happen or he foresaw it. And so in so doing and connecting with other performers and meeting Anthony here with the connection, we started talking about how we might be able to reinvigorate the story, both because of the cemetery in Rossville, which is currently now being restored, but both because of that, but because of the nature of the story that still has a lingering and a waiting and a pending justice. And so we met together with some leadership at the connection. My friends Butch and Sherry Hamilton, who are the directors of Ohio Black Expo. We all met together also in the before times and just started having this conversation around what we might be able to do to bring awareness to this story. And I think that pretty much brings us to today, and how these things are all just starting to come together. Hadley's exhibit that she's been working on, and just all the just various streams seem to right now be coming together. And so that has brought us to a place where we are working with Miami County to restore the Rossville Cemetery. We have hired designers, our landscape architect designers to come and spearhead that work. And then at the same time, we formed a nonprofit called Land of the Freed, where we are looking at land surveys and land deed titles that go back to 1846. I continued to go to the plantation, to Roanoke Plantation, and get red clay, which is available right there in the ground. The owners there are very kind. I've formed a nice friendship with them. And then I bring that red clay back and I implement it into my clay process in my sculpture and ceramics and storytelling. And so that which brings me to, I also have decided to enter seminary to help me to be able to further my faith-based justice advocacy. And so this book that we're going to be talking about tonight has become a really good companion to me in many different ways, just purpose-wise, and just looking at the way that enslaved people were treated when it came to their spirituality. I got so many questions, and looking at how my interactions with the land survey interacts with, how that juxtaposes with Greg's book and the legal documentation that he has and that he's noted in the book. So I'm glad to be here, and I'm looking forward to this conversation with you, Greg.
Right. Well, I'm delighted to be here as well. And I have to begin by thanking Paisha and Hadley for all the help that they've given me in connection with my work on this book. I met both of them as I was just starting to learn about the Randolph Freed persons. Indeed, I saw Hadley's exhibit when she first mounted it in 2017 at the museum, based on Mrs. Gilmer's Rossville collection. And I hope many of you will get to see it now at Dayton. I'm also honored to have Ross Bagby with us this evening, a man who kept this story alive, wrote a very substantial and important piece of work about it, and deserves tremendous credit for having kept a story that was important and otherwise not very well explored alive and very much at the front of historical scholarship. A Madman's Will is the story of a group of nearly 400 Virginians who gained their freedom from slavery in the 1840s and then came to settle in Western Ohio. We know a good deal about this group of people because John Randolph, the man who freed them, was famous. Their liberation was one of the largest manumissions in American history, and they were the largest group of African Americans to migrate to a free state before the Civil War. We even have a sketch of them, which was made by an English engineer who happened to see them walk up Main Street in Cincinnati on the day they arrived in 1846. Can we advance one slide to that sketch?
Well, of course, our first technical glitch occurs during the presentation, right? So let me try to share the screen.
Okay, well, I'll let you work with it, and you
Sure,
can
I'll
catch up as
apologize.
you're able to. Thank
Okay.
you, Hadley. The story of this manumission is full of twists, turns, and surprises. John Randolph had made his national political reputation by insisting that the federal government must remain small because he thought federal power could threaten slaveholders. So when he died in 1833, most people were shocked to read in the newspaper reports of his death that he had freed all of his slaves on his deathbed. The case grabbed even more attention when Randolph's last written will came to light, because his last written will did not free his slaves. It left substantially all of his large estate to the first child of his favorite niece, a 2-year-old boy who Randolph had never even seen. And it also required his executor to sell all but 100 of his slaves. That will made no one very happy. The 5 relatives who otherwise stood to inherit his property, including his favorite niece, thought Randolph should just have divided his property among them. Whether or not he had really intended to free the people he enslaved was no particular concern of theirs. Judge Lee's close friend and executor, a Virginia judge named William Lee, was unhappy with Randolph's will for a different reason. He thought Randolph had been insane on the night he wrote the will, and he knew that Randolph's earlier wills had freed his slaves. But Lee discovered he was going to have a difficult time presenting those earlier wills as Randolph's true intentions, not because they freed the slaves, but because they left the bulk of Randolph's substantial estate to Lee. It was not natural, that was the word people at the time used, for a man to leave his ancestral property to someone outside his family. Families naturally tried to invalidate a will which did that. And the best way to invalidate a will was to claim that the man who had made it was mad. So that's what Randolph's family decided to do. And their claims seemed particularly promising because Randolph had left them an awful lot to work with. John Randolph's sanity has been the focus of fascination for more than 2 centuries. The stories about his peculiarity are legion. His extravagant and wandering speeches, his erratic religious fervor, his bitter antipathies towards certain people, his flashes of violence, his talks with the devil, there's really no end to them. Perhaps one of his cousins gave the best short assessment when she testified that Randolph was at all times very eccentric and at sometimes insane. Nobody doubted that a man had the right to free his slaves. That wasn't really the problem. Virginia law had been clear since the Revolution. A slaveholder could manumit the people he enslaved as long as he supported those who were too young or too old to support themselves. A manumission would not even have to increase the number of free blacks in Virginia, because the state had a statute that required everyone freed after 1806 to go elsewhere. Still, a manumission as large as Randolph's troubled most white Virginians. It was more than a gesture of gratitude to a few favored household servants. It also didn't seem to come from deep religious conviction. And it was also difficult to cast Randolph's decision as the act of what whites like to call a good master. Randolph had always been too self-absorbed, too calculating, and by the end of his life, just too mean. So the best white Virginians could say about him was that he had been misguided, lost in the revolutionary fantasies of his youth or the anxious religious fears of his old age. The result of all this was 2 celebrity trials at the state capitol in Richmond, trials that drew attention from throughout the United States. Finally, in 1845, after repeated appeals and a 3rd trial, the will in which John Randolph had freed the people he enslaved finally went to a Virginia jury. Judge Lee had renounced the substantial inheritance Randolph left him so that he could testify for the slave's freedom. And his decision let the jury find a Solomonic solution. It let them free Randolph's slaves without entirely disinheriting his family. Randolph then persuaded Randolph's family that the estate should pay $30,000, about 4 times what the will had provided, in order to resettle the now nearly 400 freedmen in Ohio. Ohio lives in American memory today as a free state where the victims of slavery could find refuge. And Ohio, in fact, does have a proud anti-slavery heritage. But history is always naughtier than it seems. So to understand Ohio as Judge Lee encountered it when he came seeking land for the Randolph freedmen, we must set aside our preconceptions. The Black refugees fleeing north through Ohio made it impossible for most people who lived there to close their eyes to the humanitarian horrors of slavery. Yet most whites stoutly resisted Black settlement in Ohio. They claimed that they too had come to Ohio to escape the slave system, and they conflated the presence of slavery's victims with the evils of the institution itself. Even in northeastern Ohio, where anti-slavery settlers from New England predominated, there were almost no Black residents at the time. Ohio had discriminatory Black laws that were designed to discourage Black settlement. The Black laws made it illegal for anyone of African descent to live in Ohio unless 2 Ohio landowners posted a $500 bond for their support. $500 was more than the cost of most Ohio farms at the time, so almost no free Blacks could hope to satisfy that requirement. Yet Judge Lee still believed Ohio was the most promising place to settle the people freed by Randolph's will, because good land was much more available there than in the free states, the older free states north of Virginia. And prominent Ohio lawyers had assured him that, as a matter of fact, Ohio officials rarely enforced the bond requirement. Lee found a particularly promising place in Mercer County at the midpoint of Ohio's western border. About 100 Black families had already settled several thousand acres there around the village called Carthagena. That suggested that whites were willing to accept Black settlers in that area. So in the spring of 1846, Lee bought about 3,200 acres in the surrounding townships. He planned to divide that land among the 80 emancipated families, giving each of them about 40 acres. In early June, the Randolph freedmen began their long walk to Ohio, following the route that Interstate 64 now takes through West Virginia. By the time they had reached the Kanawha River on the other side of the wide Allegheny Mountains a month later, they had walked nearly 300 miles. Then they boarded a steamboat on the Kanawha River, which whisked them another 300 miles down the Kanawha and the Ohio rivers in a little more than a day. No one was surprised to see them on the hot July morning when they walked up Main Street into Cincinnati. The newspapers had been buzzing about their arrival for over a month. They were going to double the Black population in Mercer County, and politicians in Columbus were already using that prospect to swing racial prejudice into play in the upcoming autumn elections. The Ohio House had just resolved to consider the exclusion of all emancipated slaves, and the Senate had agreed by the overwhelming vote of 26-6. The backlash in Mercer County was more violent. On the morning when 3 canal boats from Cincinnati brought the Virginia settlers to New Bremen, a mob of white farmers promptly surrounded them. The mob demanded that all 383 of them post the $500 bond required by law or immediately leave the county. They set an armed guard overnight, and the next morning, they crowded the settlers onto 2 boats headed back to Cincinnati. Men with bayonets walked along the towpath beside those boats until they had crossed the county line. Mercer County's expulsion of the Black settlers quickly became national news, and the different spins that newspapers put on the story map antebellum America's dilemma over race and slavery. The Ohio papers claimed that Virginia slaveholders had no business sending poor Black people into a freed state where they would depress wages and reduce property values. From their safer distance in New York, the major anti-slavery newspapers said that free Blacks had as much right to settle Ohio as anyone else, and they bewailed the Ohio mob's racial violence. The Southern newspapers just took the opportunity to sneer at the Northern critics of slavery who recoiled at the very idea of accepting Black neighbors. A few of the Virginia settlers were able to join an existing Black community at Rumley in Shelby County, the county just south of Mercer. But most of them had to camp even further south near the canal town of Piqua for months until they could find work and new homes. Farmers in surrounding Miami County eventually hired them for the season on the understanding that Judge Lee would remove them the following year. And this is an image of the register in Miami County where all of their names were recorded at the time. And it's part of the exhibit at the Dayton Public Library, where there's an electronic link, I understand, from Hadley that will allow you to page through the book. But Lee did not remove the slaves, the free people, the following year. Once it became clear that these Virginians were not going to be allowed to settle in Mercer County, he began to sell the land he had bought there so that he could help them buy land elsewhere. He returned to Ohio in the summer of 1847 And a few weeks later, the freedmen began purchasing land in Miami and Shelby counties. Some of them managed to settle together in small communities, such as Rossville, which we've discussed, Hanktown, which was near the Quaker village of West Milton, and Marshalltown, near modern-day Pleasant Hill. The Randolph freedmen story took on a troubling meaning after the Civil War. The Reconstruction Congress had considered giving millions of emancipated slaves enough land to support themselves, the proverbial 40 acres and a mule. But the congressman from Mercer County said that the fate of John Randolph's freedmen there proved that such reparations would be pointless. Randolph's freedmen had received some of the best land in the whole country, he claimed, but they had lost it because they were simply too lazy to work it. Whites retold that tale for generations. It conflated the Randolph freedmen's attempted settlement with the earlier farming community at Carthagena, and it concealed the white violence that ultimately had driven nearly all Black settlers from the surrounding area. The Randolph Freed People lived to tell the Ohio courts a more honest story. In 1905, almost 60 years after the mob met them at New Bremen, the survivors of the migration to Ohio and their descendants filed suit to reclaim the land that had been denied them in Mercer County. The litigation dragged on for about 12 years until the Ohio Supreme Court finally decided that the claims were invalid because the freedmen had waited too long to bring them. But the judicial record still preserves their story. And what it tells us is clear. The Randolph Freed People and their descendants felt dispossessed for the very simple reason that they had been. So I think there are, or I hope there will be some questions, and I'm very happy to answer them and to talk to Paisha about her questions.
And I just want to deeply apologize for the technical issues that we had. Thank you so much for your understanding and bearing with me, who was the problem.
Thank you for getting it to work.
All right, so we do have some really great questions already in the Q&A here. And
Yeah, before you do that though, I'm sorry. Can we have Paisha kind of go through her questions? That might help.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Paisha need to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I have a long list, but I'll start with just the first few. Well, the first one is in the book you talk about Francis Scott Key and William Meade being friends of John Randolph, and that they too were left a part of the inheritance to make sure that the manumitted enslaved people would it would go to their care. So I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit. And then I wondered, just as a follow-up to that, about Jubba and Hetty and those closer ones, about why their provisions might have been different.
Yeah. Okay. Great questions. Randolph was a very close friend of Francis Scott Key, and he was related in a sort of Virginia kind of way to Bishop Meade, although they were less close. So Randolph asked both of those people to be trustees for the enslaved people, the freed people under his will. As a matter of fact, however, Judge Lee, who was the executor, ended up playing the role that Meade and Key were probably intended to play. Meade and Key were both, for somewhat different reasons, sort of reluctant to get deeply involved in the case. They were men in the public spotlight, and being involved in a case like this was sort of awkward for them. So although Bishop Meade was actually the named party in some of the litigation, neither he nor Key were very actively involved, and they sort of left it to Meade, who they knew and trusted, to use the money that was in the estate to buy the land in Ohio and to provide for the migration. And Lee, as I mentioned in my talk, actually negotiated a much better settlement for the freed people than the will had even provided. Basically because by giving up his own inheritance under the will, he acquired a tremendous amount of credibility and was able to put a lot of pressure on the family, on Randolph's family. Your second question was about some of the enslaved people at Roanoke who we actually know something about. We have from their manumission a list of everybody who was freed. But we know something about them. We know their names, we know their heights, their complexions, but we don't know a great deal about the people who worked in the fields because nobody wrote very much about them. The people who lived in Randolph's household, by comparison, were discussed by Randolph himself, by his friends. Their names even get into the newspapers. Juba and John White were probably the best known because they were Randolph's principal servants, manservants, and they traveled with him a lot. In fact, the frontispiece of my book is a portrait of Juba, one of the very few portraits of an enslaved person in Virginia, solo portraits of an enslaved person in Virginia that I'm aware of. Most enslaved people tend to appear in the background of portraits of the white people who enslaved them. Randolph's other household servants, like Hetty and his cook and so on, are mentioned in some of the surviving historical evidence, and I've tried to discuss them in the book to the extent that we do know anything about them. What we do know about them is that they were with Randolph pretty much throughout his life, and that by the end of his life, he was actually very abusive toward them, sometimes in very cruel physical ways.
Would that have been more so than you also mentioned that it was at least the Tuckers considered it like counterproductive to harm their slaves? Would there be some other reason why he was harsher on those particular people? And then I'll yield it for everybody else.
Yes, it was. I think it was because as he grew older, he grew more insane, and his behavior became, erratic, irrational, more violent. So people whom he had treated, not well, but perhaps decently, came in for a lot of abuse as he became more and more ill late in his life. And in that way, they were, like many unfortunate enslaved people throughout the South, who suffered from their masters' illnesses of all kinds.
Yeah. Thank you.
So Paisha, do you have any more questions, or can we go to the audience questions?
I think we can go to the audience questions now. And one of the audience has a similar question, and that'd be Mr. Hamilton. So I just wanted to point that out.
Okay. Hadley, how do you want to handle the questions? You just mean you can play tag team?
Yeah, that sounds great. You want to go first?
Okay, we have a question from Ross Bagby, who says, who's grateful for Gregory citing Ross's 1998 dissertation in 2 footnotes, ask about Randolph's half-brother Beverly Tucker. you portray him as being as much as pro-slavery, yet in the secessionist 1850 National Convention, Beverly dumbfounded other Southern fire eaters and, as another historian says, proved himself a Tucker by proposing an independent Southern Confederacy institution, a colonization plan. How do you fit that into your version?
Yeah. Well, as I said earlier, I'm honored to have Mr. Bagby in the audience today, and his question is a reflection of his own deep understanding of this whole story. Colonization is a very interesting and controversial subject in the modern historiography of slavery. And I think the consensus which is emerging, with which I agree, is that colonization wasn't really anti-slavery. Indeed, it's probably better understood as white supremacy in a different form. Colonizationists were sometimes, especially early in the colonization movement, people who hoped that removing Black people from the United States would be a way of encouraging voluntary manumissions that would, over time, rid the country of all Black people. And that was their objective. That was the way they thought both races would be better off. As time went on, however, it became clear that some colonizationists, many colonizationists perhaps, were more focused on the removal of all free Blacks, who they thought were a problem for the binary system of enslavement that worked better if all Blacks who remained in the United States were enslaved. Beverly Tucker himself is a very complicated man, very intelligent man, whose views changed somewhat throughout his life. And as a young person, he, like some other members of the Tucker family, probably was more enlightened than many other white people about slavery and about the possibility of gradual manumission. Indeed, his father, John Randolph's stepfather, proposed one of the most sensible gradual emancipation plans that was ever proposed in the state of Virginia, which got absolutely no hearing from the state legislature. But by the time of the 1850 convention, Beverly Tucker was himself almost a fire eater. And so I think it's fair to understand his continued support for colonization at that time as an expression of his view that the best way to manage Black people and slavery in a new Southern Republic would be to get rid of all the free people and then make arrangements for continued enslavement or gradual manumission or emancipation that would involve colonization. So that by the end of the process, if there were no more slaves, there also would be no more Black people in the Southern Republic.
Okay, I'm gonna jump in and have Haley ask the next question. We have about 12, so we got to get through them. So thank you.
Okay. I'll try to be quick.
That's right. Can't be quick with these answers. Abby Marshall says this was an amazing context. I was wondering if you had any insight to the Samuel Gist settlement in Highland County, same situation. Gist freed his slaves upon his death through his will, and they settled in Ohio. There were 3 sites. Brown County had a location as well. However, the Gist settlers in Highland County near Leesburg had backlash from the community and help from the Quaker community. A long statement to ask if you had any information on the settlement that you found from your research into the Randolph story. Thanks for a great presentation. And I think you talk about this in the book a bit.
I do, and perhaps that's the best way to answer the question. The book actually discusses briefly the gift settlers, and it cites some of the best material that's been written about them. There's a great story there, and I think with investigation it could be further developed.
Okay, I'll go to the next question, which is, do we have any knowledge about whether Auglaize County Attorney Joseph Plunkett's appointment by William Lee as POA in October 1846 was a valid appointment? And do we have any evidence that supports William Lee's consent/awareness of the sale of the land by William Plunkett as POA? And if you could tell everybody what a POA is, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay. Yes. As I mentioned in my talk just now, and I discussed further in the book, once Lee determined that the whites in Mercer County really were adamantly going to prevent future settlement by the freed people in Mercer County, he decided to sell the land there. And he gave a local lawyer named Plunkett a power of attorney, POA, power of attorney, to sell the land for him. That power of attorney is valid. It's recorded in the deed books. Plunkett did act as Lee's agent for the sale of the land because somebody locally had to manage that process. And I know that there is, and has over the years been some belief that Plunkett may have pocketed some of the money. And I can't say that's not true, but I was unable to find any evidence of that. And given that Lee was a sophisticated person who knew what the land was worth, and given that we know Lee collected actually more for the land than he had paid for it, I doubt that Plunkett did pocket the money.
Our next question is there any record of who was in the crowd in New Bremen? And another question, where can one find the actual plots of land in Mercer County? Two things you also addressed in the book. And maybe, Paisha, if you can also briefly talk about the work you're doing there too.
Do you want to start, Paisha?
Yes. I've only heard anecdotes about who the crowd was. It's been speculated that the crowd was KKK, and there are a list of members. I don't know, Gregory, if you have that list, but there are some people who wrote the petition that circulated their memorandum of understanding that they sent around to politicians. There are names associated to that document, and that document it's available at the History Connection. I can also upload it here. And where can one find the actual plots of land in Mercer County? So Land of the Freed is working on those plots, and also some of the plots have, most, if not many, if not all of the plots are mentioned in the book. But then I also talked with someone on our land research committee that says they may have more information on other plots that might not have made it into the book. So we do have land surveys of the land titles for the sales that happened between William Lee and who he purchased those land plots from.
The document that you referred to that was signed by men in Mercer County was actually published in newspapers. And so although we don't know who was in the mob, we do know that those men, the men who signed the resolutions, were very active. And so it's reasonable to conclude that they and people like them were in the mob. One newspaper editor in, I think it was Columbus or Cincinnati, it's cited in the book, actually looked them up in the tax records and published a somewhat sarcastic note pointing out that the land they owned was actually worth substantially less than the land that belonged to the freed people. So they were probably a combination of small farmers, tradespeople, landless farm laborers, and so on. The best way to determine what land Lee bought for the freed people is just to go to the deeds in Mercer County. I found deeds for about 3,200 acres. 3,200 acres is the amount of land that the freed people and their descendants claimed in the lawsuits they filed in 1905. And those lawsuits actually designate the particular tracts because they sued each landowner individually. So if you go to their petitions for relief, the ones that were filed in 1905 through 1907 and are still available in the Mercer County Courthouse, you can find the exact tracts. And I have cited those deeds in the book. I did not cite all the petitions because that was going to end up with a footnote that was about 2 pages long, but it's fairly easy to retrieve that information in Mercer County. And they're great because Ohio's land system is so rational and sensible. They're great maps of Mercer County at the time that actually had the names of the landowners on them, so that it's easy to relate the names that you find in the petitions in the courthouse to particular plots of land that are on the maps. So you can tell exactly where it was.
Okay, well, let's go to our next question, which is from Mr. Larry Hamilton. Hi, Mr. Hamilton. He's a resident of Piqua, and as Hadley kind of touched on, he's a good expert on this whole subject. His question is, do you think that the Randolph narrative and the many other early Black settlements of Ohio need to be advocated for collectively for a museum in Rossville?
Well, hi, Larry. I'm so glad you're part of the conversation this evening. Larry was very helpful to me when I was doing my research, and I'm grateful to him. I think from the material that the museum has, that Hadley has curated in her exhibits, it would certainly be possible to create some sort of a permanent exhibition. And I think that would be a great testament to this story.
All right, thank you. Our next question is, has anyone ever applied for an historical marker for the lock in New Bremen to be erected? If not, can the Ohio History Connection help accomplish that? Geraldine, do you have a short answer of how that whole process works on our side, on the OHC side?
Well, I don't have a short answer, but I will dig into real quick and look on the website. We do have a process, and there may be one there for the lock, but I don't know off the top of my head. So let me put the website, and basically that way you can check to see if there is one there, but it also explains the process of getting an historical site for an area that you're interested in, making sure we recognize. But I will say this, that we're encountering it a little bit, that the process is not very, well, it can be strenuous because you got to do a lot of research, but the bigger issue, frankly, is getting the actual plaque creative, because there's only one. Well, as far as we know, we work with one company that works with lots of states to do historic markers. And I heard recently that they're about 3 or 4 years behind. So it's a process. You have to be patient. And we've actually reached out to a local monument company in Xenia that's going to do one for us because we can't wait that long. So it's a process. So please, thanks a lot for your question. I'll look for the link while Hadley asks the next question. And we do have several more. So I'm not saying, I know you guys want an in-depth conversation and we love this, but we'll try to make sure. We may go over, obviously it's 7, I'm sorry, almost 8 o'clock. We'll stay on for another 15 minutes to answer the current questions, if everybody's okay with that.
All right. The next question reads, during census taking, often field slaves were at best noted by a first name and age. Following manumission, how did the Randolph freedmen get full names?
During the or in the Virginia census, the Randolph slaves weren't even recorded by name. So the only way we know their first names is from the manumission record, the list that was created when they were actually freed in 1846, which is the list that's part of Hadley's exhibit and is at the Dayton Library now. That list was transcribed and recorded in the Miami County records. As to how they got their surnames, I can't really answer that question. When we go to the census of 1850 in the relevant counties of Ohio, we can find these people by looking in the areas where we know they settled and finding families that had all the same first names that we find in the manumission records. And of course, by this time and in the census, a surname is attached. But as to how they chose those surnames, we really don't know. The only one about which I have a sort of theory is the name Moten. It was not unusual for enslaved people in Virginia to have surnames. Indeed, many of them did. It's just that white people either didn't know them or didn't use them. And many of those surnames were taken not so much from the people who owned them as just from people with whom they had come in contact. And among the people who the early Randolph enslaved people came in contact with was a man named Morton, who was sort of an agent or manager for the Randolph family when the plantation at Roanoke and the other plantations in the surrounding counties were absentee properties. And so my guess is that the free people in Ohio who used the name Moten were probably descended from some of the very earliest of the Randolph slaves who had been sent into the Virginia Piedmont probably in the 1750s, certainly no later than the 1760s. And they really were, pioneers. They were sent into an unsettled part of the state to carve out new plantations.
And I'll also say, and correct me if I'm misremembering here, but I believe that in Ross Bagby's dissertation, he discusses this issue with several people in particular. There's, I think, George Ewell, who changes his name several times throughout his life. So I think, you're right to ask that question. The issue of name and identity is a really a deep issue here in these stories. The next question is from Mr. Hamilton again. We're so glad that you could be here with us today and honored. So he says, I'm curious about the relationships of Randolph enslaved people in Ohio with those freed earlier at the Israel Hill settlement in Virginia. And this is another thing that you do touch on in the book.
Yes. Well, they were, because they originally came from the same enslaved population, they were related, many of them very closely related. And the ones who were freed and sent to settle at Israel Hill were often selected for no better reason than that they just happened to be working on the plantation that Randolph's brother operated rather than the one that John Randolph operated. So yes, they were very frequently not just friends, but closely related to each other. There's a great book, by the way, by a professor at William and Mary in Virginia, Melvin Patrick Ely, called Israel on the Appomattox, about the freed people who settled at Israel Hill. Now, I highly recommend it. It won the Bancroft Prize about 20 years ago.
All right. Another question. Can you say how the Emlyn Institute played a significant role?
The Emlyn Institute at Carthagena was the successor to a manual labor college that was founded by a Quaker, Connecticut Quaker named Augustus Wattles. Several years before Judge Lee decided to purchase land in that area. And a New Jersey Quaker named Samuel Emlyn left a very substantial portion of his estate for Black education, which his trustees used to buy Wattles Manual Labor College and rename it the Emlyn Institute. The site was subsequently acquired by the Society of the Precious Blood, and it was a seminary, and it's now the building that's on the site is now a wonderful home for retired people.
All right, the next question, I apologize if I missed this during the presentation. However, we know of a Randolph freedman who returned to the slave South as a result of his treatment in Ohio. Can you tell us more about him? Do we know anything about him after he crosses the border back in the South? And this was one of the things I was so excited to read about in your book.
Yes, it's a great part of the story. The man who returns is John White, one of John Randolph's principal manservants, who was a fairly elderly man by this time. He was I've forgotten his exact age, but I think he was in his early 60s. Because of the treatment of the freed people in Ohio, he and his family, except for one of his sons, decided to return to Southside Virginia, where they had come from. They were taking a chance because Virginia law said that an emancipated person who returned to Virginia would be whipped and sold back into slavery. But John White was a fairly well-known figure in his own right. He was an elderly man, and I think he figured that his connection to Randolph would see him through, and it did. A few years later, he and his family show up in the records of Charlotte County, their home county in the South Side, as freed people with permission to remain there. He died in Ohio, by the way, because he died on a visit to his son a few years after that.
I loved that he was still visiting, coming back to visit his family. I felt like that was a really important detail that you included. Next question is, stage 4 syphilis migrates to and attacks the brain. Is this what happened to Randolph and caused his insanity?
Randolph's sanity is really a deep and difficult question. And I've tried in the book, and I'll try tonight, not to apply a modern diagnosis or modern concepts toward characterizing it, because his behavior is historically important because of the way in which his contemporaries perceived it. And so that's the way I've tried to describe it. But having said that, it seems to me that he probably had a psychological or several psychological problems that we today would find fairly easy to diagnose, and that did not have necessarily a physical origin. He did, however, have physical peculiarities. He appears never to have fully matured sexually. And again, there is much speculation in the historiography about why that was true. Did he have a genetic disorder, had some sort of a childhood illness, changed his development, and so on and so on? And we simply don't know.
All right, the next question, did the freed families travel as one large group to Ohio, or did they go separately?
They traveled as one large group. And in that way, they were different from the Gist settlers who came in waves.
All right, and let's see. Do we have any clues about whether any of the Randolph Freed people were related to John Randolph or any other Randolphs?
We don't. We know, excuse me, we know that a small percentage of them, or a percentage of them that was roughly equivalent to the percentage elsewhere in Virginia, were of mixed race. And we can tell that from the physical descriptions in the manumission records. But there is no historical evidence, no particular way of finding out whether that was the result of relationships with members of the Randolph families or other white people in the area. We do know that some of them were children of one of Randolph's overseers, because Randolph, when he found out about it, confronted the man in front of his neighbors, fired him, and then sued him. Not so much, I think, because Randolph was trying to protect the Black women in his workforce, but because Randolph perceived that kind of behavior as sort of an affront to Randolph himself.
I would just add that there are plenty of people named Randolph with that last name who could be traced back to the overall larger Randolph family. That would be his brother too, Richard, whose freed people ended up at Israel Hill. So that we know that could just happen because they were property of those people. But there are some surnames, some people who were freed with the surname Randolph.
Right. But as you say, the surname is not necessarily a good indication of an actual family relationship.
This is a question at, I believe, Paisha, if you'd like to address this one. It says, this person works with the schools in Miami County and would be interested in finding ways to bring this history to their students. Has there been any effort to do this?
Yeah, so first I want to say, and this is another shout out to Mr. Larry Hamilton, who I think it would be accessible and is and has been the only educator in Piqua schools for the topic of Black history or African American history. I, and I'm sure others who have graduated from schools around there who are familiar with the story would be happy to connect and talk about how we can help you share this very important, much needed Miami County history in schools. So I'm glad you asked.
Let's see, what is the status of the reparations for this free slaves descendants? That might be another great question for you, Paisha.
Okay, thank you. So the term reparations is a difficult term because reparations indicates that because of just being enslaved and having built this country by being enslaved, there's, in my opinion, a right and a deserving reparations. This also, to me, is more of state-sanctioned violence, where the state allowed improper seizure of this land. And this, to me, means it needs to be a factor of restorative justice. And so all of my efforts and all of the efforts related to my work with Land of the Freed are toward public awareness so that this can become a part, be tried in the court of public opinion for a bill that would restore what my ancestors lost through the improper seizure of their land. Good question. Thank you.
Let's see here. There's another question about the Johnston farm. Do we have any good evidence about the free people camped at the Johnston farm and Indian agency after being sent away from New Bremen?
Well, first of all, I should thank you, Hadley, for directing me toward a very valuable collection of papers at Wright State that contains some of that evidence. Thank you very much for that. There is a letter from Colonel Johnston to his son-in-law talking about the fact that the free people are still here, and he's writing from his farm in August of that year, and that Quakers had been coming to visit them, and that he thought the Quakers would be able to identify among the freed people a woman who would be willing to come to Dayton and act as a household servant for them. We also know that Johnston was involved in this problem in other ways, because a number of newspaper articles talk about him being part of the delegation that Judge Lee formed to go to St. Mary's and elsewhere to talk to the local white population about settling the freed people in those areas.
And then there is a question from Mr. Hamilton. Couldn't a DNA study accomplish a link to the identity of white Randolph ancestors? Henry Louis Gates and Finding Your Roots should be contacted for that segment. Paisha, did you want to talk to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I'm working on that from an angle where my friend Julie and I are working to see if I can become a daughter of the American Revolution to get some of that genealogy history. But yes, and there's another attorney named Roberto Lopez who had some access to DNA information like that, where he was able to trace people back to some of the freed people. So I'm almost positive that DNA could do that.
There was one question in the chat before it gets lost about the Carthagena cemetery. Do we have any information on that?
Do you want to answer that, Paisha? You probably know more about it.
I do not know enough about the Carthagena cemetery. Mr. Hamilton is well versed with that cemetery. So I don't have enough information to speak intelligently about that one.
There are other cemeteries that are important to this group of people. There's one at Hanktown, for example, which is, quite visible from the road, as well as the one at Rossville that we've mentioned in this conversation this evening several times.
And there is, if you are interested in contacting Mr. Hamilton, he runs a wonderful historical site related to this narrative in Piqua. So, I encourage you, if you're in the area, to visit him there. They also have fantastic coffee. So it's a great stop. Little history, little coffee, you're set. So you can maybe talk to him about Carthagena Cemetery if you schedule a visit. All right, I think that that covers our questions tonight. Thank you all so much for really wonderful questions. This has been a really great conversation. Thank you so much, Mr. May and Paisha. You're both just wonderful people, and the work that you're doing on this narrative is truly incredible. Ms. Barbie, do you want to say anything?
Again, yeah, I just want to remind everybody that I think I get the questions in my report from Zoom. So what we'll do is that we'll go ahead and the ones we didn't get to tonight, we'll go ahead and put, if Greg doesn't mind, I'll send him a short email once I get the questions, and you just give a real brief answer, and maybe they at least give the answer to the questions. As for the chat, I think I also get that too. So let me work on that. So it may give me an extra couple of days before I send it out, but I'll try to get the video sent to you. It'll be posted on our YouTube page. And if the questions make a little bit longer, I may end up sending that in a second email. But we are so thankful for you guys hanging in with us. I've learned so much tonight. And well, I guess I don't know if I have enough time to share real quick. If you would like to, contribute to our efforts to keep everything going, we would appreciate a small donation. We're not asking that, you don't have to, but we just would love, to be able to share this program that we've been doing with a lot of people. This is Paisha again. Sorry, I didn't really do it right. I'm still right. Here we go. And, if you'd like to make a small donation, please go to our Ohio History website at www.ohiohistory.org. Give NAAMCC. So again, thank you so much. This was so great. And we appreciate you guys spending the evening with us, and have a great evening and weekend.